Just wait till you see the crazy plot twist on this one. But I won't hold you up, so let's get into today's Mystery Madness. On March 4th, a 23-year-old man named Julian Bushwald was going to go pick up his girlfriend Carolyn Watson so that they could go on a romantic picnic date near a waterfall on Julian's parents' land. Julian's parents owned a property of over 12,000 acres of land in Australia, and it was really normal for the two of them to go out and drive around and spend most of their time in nature due to them being in an area where there's really not much else to do. And just to give you some backstory, at this point Julian and Carolyn have been dating for about 2 years and planned on getting married. And we know this because they both had a conversation about it with their church pastor. See, the both of them were devout Christians that were constantly at church, which is where they actually met. And so that morning Julian picked up Carolyn from her house in Churchill, Australia, and before leaving to where they planned on going, Julian had to make a stop at his house first to pick up some stuff that they needed for the picnic, which was pretty much the food. And so after he picked up the food, at some point along the route to the area that they planned on going, Julian passed by some roadkill that he wanted to check out. So after finding a safe place to park a little ways up, he hopped out the car and walked in the direction that the roadkill was in, but it was a little further back, so while Carolyn decided to wait for him, Julian disappeared into the distance. Carolyn wasn't interested in taking a look, and it was relatively normal for Julian to get easily distracted by something while they were out and about, so she figured that she would just wait in the car for him to come back. But after about 10 minutes had passed by, Carolyn had become a little concerned because it doesn't typically take Julian this long to go check something out. So at this point, she's starting to debate whether or not she should go out to check on Julian and see if everything was okay. And as she was debating with herself, she seen something in the side view mirror of the car that absolutely terrified her. She seen a man dressed in black with a mask and gloves on running towards her door, and before she even had time to react and lock them, the man rushed over and opened the passenger side door and dragged her outside. The man then duct taped her mouth, hog-tied her, and threw her into the back seat of the car. Now, the way that Carolyn was positioned didn't really allow her to see what was going on, and since she was hog-tied, she really couldn't move either. But she felt the car start to move, and so she realized that at this point, she was being kidnapped. And after what felt like an eternity, she finally felt the car stop, and that's when the door opened, and then he dragged her out and threw her onto the ground. And so at this point, Carolyn was trying to see if she could recognize where she was, but she couldn't tell much about the area other than that it was heavily forested. And so the man grabbed her, took a knife, and cut all of her clothes off, leaving her completely naked. And again, she can't really see what's going on, and she can't really move to check, but she would start to hear something that to her meant death was nearby. She heard what sounded like the man digging a hole just a few feet away from them, and at this point, Carolyn assumed that she was probably gonna be violated and then murdered, which is why he's digging her grave. So at this point, feeling helpless, the only thing Carolyn could do was to pray. And now at the same time that all of this is happening, Julian's parents back home start to worry that something is wrong when they notice that they weren't back by 3 p.m. like they expected. It wasn't like them to normally be late, and by the time 4 p.m. came, Julian's mother had a gut feeling that something just wasn't right. So she began nervously pacing back and forth and constantly checking her driveway to see if she can see Julian coming up the road. And as Julian's mother starts to pace back and forth in the driveway, something caught her eye. She noticed something sticking out of part of the wire fence that goes around their property. And when she got closer to see what it was, she noticed that it was a glass bottle with a piece of paper inside of it. And so curious as to what it was, she pulls the note out and reads it, and that's when she knew that her terrible gut feeling was right. The note essentially said,
"Just couldn't leave us alone, so your son and girl went walkabouts. You get Carolyn and Julian back when we finish our business in the area, but only if you behave yourself and put us around again. Tell everyone they're on holiday, and don't you dare talk to the cops again, and you get your kids back. Push again and you'll never see them again because we'll put the girl to death and burn her alive. And the boy will really enjoy them and sacrifice to our God to pay back 180 times the hurt he did to us while we picked him up. This is your last warning. Do what we say and the kids will come back in a live condition."
Nonetheless, in a frantic state of mind, Julian's mother ignored the directions in the letter and called the police anyways. And a search party was quickly organized to help his mother find Julian and Carolyn. And so they decided to start where the couple told the parents they would be, somewhere on their 12,000-acre property. But as soon as they started, they knew that the search was going to be a rough one because of how rugged and heavily forested with side roads and dirt paths the Bushwalds' property was. But something came to light not too long after that heightened the authorities' suspicions. It was recently brought to light that just 10 days earlier, Carolyn's family had also received a threatening note. The note was found by Carolyn's father on the front porch of their house, and the note warned the family to stay away, or whoever it was that left the note was gonna make their lives miserable and destroy their family. And Carolyn's father reported the note at the time, but not much was done about it because the police said that it was likely that it was just some dark prank by some teenagers trying to be edgy. But it was clear now though that the note that was found by Carolyn's father wasn't just a prank, and it was definitely by the same person or people because the handwriting was identical, and on both the notes they mentioned the families having some kind of contact with whoever this was. But both of the families just couldn't wrap their heads around it though, because they couldn't think of absolutely anybody that they have had any kind of recent conflict with. But something in the notes pointed to something even more strange. In the note, they stated that they were a part of a group that considered Christians their enemies. Both of the notes also had some kind of satanic symbols that were discovered to be used by a cult called the Order of Nine Angles. And according to reports, the Order of Nine Angles was a cult that originated in the UK in the 1960s. But they weren't really recognized until the 1980s when some of their members became known for their politically extreme ideologies. And since the 1980s, they extended several branches across the world. But it's known that they encourage their members to isolate themselves from the public and the rest of the world, as well as encouraging their members to commit crimes and be violent, along with preaching human sacrifice. Considering that they're known for embracing human sacrifice and the note insinuating that they were the ones that kidnapped them, the families were in extreme panic. But there was one thing that stumped the investigators. There was no official reports of the Order of Nine Angles being in Australia. It's assumed that it's possible that this may have been a way of the Order of Nine Angles making their big debut or big entrance into Australia. But a couple days passed and unfortunately authorities haven't been able to find a single trace of Julian or Carolyn. And at this point the police weren't completely sold on the idea that this was actually being done by the Order of Nine Angles. But one thing that they were sure of is that the couple was missing due to foul play for sure. And even if the couple wasn't kidnapped by this mysterious cult, they were worried that they would have little chance of survival at this point due to the ruggedness of the bushland and the fact that they only had the clothes that they were wearing and the food that they brought with them to eat on their picnic. And if they were alive and lost somewhere in the wilderness, they would experience wild fluctuations of temperature between the day and nights, plus all of the harsh terrain and venomous animals. And the more time that passed by, the investigators knew that it was much less likely that they were looking for Julian and Carolyn, and much more likely that they were looking for Julian and Carolyn's bodies. But finally, after a full 6 excruciatingly stressful days, the authorities were able to deliver some news to the parents of the young couple. Carolyn and Julian were both found alive. The young couple stumbled out onto the roadway near Alpine National Park and were picked up by a farmer who was passing by. And the main reason that the authorities weren't able to find them was because that park was several hundred miles away from where they both disappeared. So far in fact that it was roughly a 6-hour trip by car ride. And when they were found, they had serious sunburns, cuts, blisters, and bruises, and they were emaciated too, but other than that, they were thankfully physically okay. And since the police were still worried about the notes that both of the families received, they decided to interview both Julian and Carolyn immediately while the information was still fresh in their heads, to find out all of the information that they could about the perpetrators who did this to them. Carolyn was the first one to be interviewed, and while she was interviewed, she said that she was naked and tied up, and the man continued to dig the hole a few feet away from her. And she continued to pray knowing that she was likely gonna die soon. But as she was praying, she noticed that the man stopped digging. It sounded like the attacker momentarily walked away, leaving her alone. And still frightened by the fact that this man is probably gonna come back soon and finish the job, she struggled for some time with her restraints, trying to free herself. But she knew that at this point, it was a race against the clock. And that's when Carolyn heard something that finally gave her some peace of mind. It was Julian's voice calling out for her. And when she looked over, Julian was naked and tied up too, but managed to wiggle his way over where she was. And after making his way over, he was able to grab a knife that the attacker left behind on a pile of other stuff. And so he quickly used the knife to cut himself free, and once he was free, he went over and cut Carolyn's restraints as well. Terrified that the attackers would be back soon, panicking, they looked around to see where they were, but just like before, they realized that they were in a heavily forested area in the middle of nowhere. And so they grabbed a sleeping bag and food that was left behind, and they ran off still completely naked. And so as they were walking around the woods, Julian filled Carolyn in on what happened to him while he was gone. Julian says that he believes that it was a setup. When he bent over to look at the dead animal, he heard quick footsteps behind him, and before he knew it, he was violently cracked in the back of the head so hard that he went unconscious and didn't wake up for a few hours later. And that's when he started to come to the realization of the situation that he was in. He found himself completely naked and tied up, and that's when he started to call for Carolyn. And so Carolyn told the investigators that from there, for the next few days, they were desperately trying to find their way out of the rugged area, and they didn't have much of anything but the few things that they stole before they took off running. The temperatures were fluctuating dramatically, with the days being extremely hot and the nights being extremely cold, to a point where they were barely able to keep warm. And on top of all of that, they were in complete fear that the attacker would find them before they would be able to make their way out of the woods. And things got even scarier when they got so turned around while trying to find their way out that they ended up back at the site where they were held hostage. And while they were there, scared for their lives, Julian managed to muster up the courage to run over and grab some clothes and a backpack that was left behind so that they were at least able to cover themselves. And finally, after about a week, they managed to find their way out and stumble out onto the road, where they flagged down help from the farmer that was passing by. And so when police interviewed Julian about his side of the story, he basically reiterated all the details that Carolyn told him, minus the parts that he was unconscious for. And so based on these reports, the police thought that the best course of action would be to track down the site that he had brought them to after being kidnapped, in hopes that it would give them some more clues. And surprisingly, they were actually able to find the site where this happened, and they were able to gather up some evidence, including a shovel, duct tape, rope, and the clothes that had been cut off of Julian and Carolyn. But something came to light that made the police highly suspicious. When the police analyzed all of the evidence, they determined that all of the belongings, minus Carolyn's clothes, belonged to Julian. Now, before they came to this realization, the police did find a couple inconsistencies in his version of the story. One of them being that the place on the back of his head that he said he was struck at that made him go unconscious barely had a mark at all. And after intense pressure of questioning, Julian finally cracked, admitting that he was the one behind the whole thing. But the police were wondering why? What was his goal? And according to Julian, he planted the black clothing, mask, and gloves that he used so that Carolyn didn't recognize him, as well as all of the other items that he was gonna need to commit the crime. And it was also him that sent both of the notes to the family so that it would throw the police off of his lead and make it seem like it was the code that was behind their disappearances. He says that he made up the excuse of seeing that roadkill to be able to pull off onto the side of the road without raising any suspicion. And during the time that he was gone checking out the roadkill, he changed out of his clothes and into the ones that he planted and collected his things before going in after Carolyn and tying her up. And once he'd driven all the way up to Alpine National Park, he dug a hole where he planned on burying all of the items that would have given his involvement in the case away. This means that when Carolyn believed that the attacker was digging her grave, she was actually hearing Julian trying to hide all of the evidence from what was happening. And then as for his car, he hid it deeper into the woods so that they couldn't use it to get back to safety right away. And after everything was hidden, Julian cut his own clothes and tied himself up and started to call for Carolyn as if he'd just woken up. The off decision that the attacker decided to leave them alone with a couple things were a few supplies that Julian left behind to make sure that they didn't starve or freeze to death. But to make it realistic, Julian made sure not to make them too uncomfortable, and he especially made sure that they were left naked. But it all begs the question, why did Julian do this? What were his intentions? Well, it turns out that though Julian and Carolyn planned on getting married, there was a disagreement as to when. Julian wanted to get married right away, but Carolyn wanted to wait until she at least finished school. And normally something like this wouldn't have been a problem, but it was for Julian, who wanted to have sex. But since they were both extremely religious, sexual relations were out of the question until marriage, which is why Julian's plans were to leave them alone, naked, and in fear of death. He hoped that under these conditions, it would pressure Carolyn into having relations with him. And over the several days that Julian and Carolyn were out there suffering, he continuously made excuses as to why it was a good idea to have these sexual relations. He said that since they were about to die, that they might as well leave the world being essentially married in God's eyes, and even suggested that getting physical was necessary to keep them warm and alive. But Carolyn wasn't hearing any of it. She continued to deny it and stick to her faith, believing that God would get them out of that situation. And one of the craziest details was that among the items that Julian stashed before pulling off this stunt was a map of Alpine National Park, meaning that they were never really lost at all. Julian just had them basically walking in circles, hoping that if he waited long enough, that it would wear Carolyn down into eventually agreeing with him. And knowing the entire time that Carolyn was genuinely scared for her life, thinking that there was some murder out there looking for them, Julian only led them out of the forest after it became clear that Carolyn wasn't gonna cave under pressure. And now after Julian confessed, he was charged with multiple charges, and in 2009 he was convicted of kidnapping and making false reports. But this wasn't the end of the story. It turns out that Julian was granted bail before his sentencing, meaning that he wouldn't be officially taken into custody until the sentence was actually handed to him. And so just before he was sentenced in September of 2009, Julian got an Indian passport and boarded a flight. And reports vary on whether or not the passport was legit, but it's mostly theorized that it was a real Indian passport that Julian doctored with his own photo. And before taking that photo, Julian dyed his hair black and covered himself in as much tanning solution as possible to darken his skin, thinking that it would make him look more Indian. And though it was decently obvious that something was off about Julian, considering he was initially very light-skinned with light hair and light blue eyes, he still managed to get past the Australian airport officials. But when Julian got to India, they immediately denied him access into the country and was sent back part way, where he was arrested by Australian officials in Singapore. But investigators believe that India was only supposed to be a stop along his way to Germany, where he had family. But ironically, even though Julian was taken back to Australia and given a 7-year 3-month sentence plus an additional 6 months for fleeing while on bail, Germany is where he would actually end up anyways, because when Julian was 1 year old, he was brought to Australia from Germany, where he was originally born. And he never bothered to get his Australian citizenship despite him living there practically his whole life. And as a result, while he was still in jail in 2014, the Immigration and Border Protection Department notified Julian that his permanent residency visa was under review. And though Julian fought relentlessly to avoid having his visa canceled, he was unsuccessful. And he was deported to Germany, where he couldn't really make friends or really do much of anything due to the language barrier between him and the German citizens. But if you want to hear another story even more mysterious than this one, watch this video here.